Okay, you guys ready to start?
Yeah, Jenny.
Yes. Thank you for this time, and thank you, Andy, for passing it off to us. For our research, for this year, we focused on how possibility mentoring works in the virtual realm because we did the whole year of school mentoring virtually this year.
So just to kind of pick up from the last presentation, we're looking specifically at virtual mentoring across cultures. And here's a little presentation outline. We're going to go through some key topics for discussion, our research question, our methodology, some sample code books, and some key findings. So just to kind of anchor us here, we asked ourselves in this era of virtual mentoring across cultures, what are some of the implications of using the 5-step possibility process in a virtual mentoring session? Or how do students engage virtually using a possibility development model? You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Sandy.
Andy has already touched up on this briefly, but the unique thing about our mentors is that they are action researchers. And action research is like a method of systemic inquiry where the mentors undertake as researchers of their own practice. Thus, like the mentors directly are working in the field and with their mentees, and they're observing, collecting data, and then they interpret the mentoring process as they reflect on their work. They come up with ideas and action strategies, and then they put that into practice. Next. So each week, like the mentors write a memo reflecting on the mentoring session that they had. They have about 24 to 48 hours to complete the memos and submit the memos after the mentoring has ended. And this is like a way for them to write the memos in as much details of the session as possible from their memory. And each of the memos are divided into 2 to 3 parts. It includes the descriptive memo where they capture the physical timeline of what has happened during the mentoring and like the activities that they do during the sessions. And then in the middle, there's the analytic memo, as you can see, where basically they kind of reflect on what they have done and what has happened in the session. And they go a little bit more in depth about what they think about their mentees, what has happened well in the session, what hasn't happened well in the session. And they explain things that hasn't been touched up on the descriptive memo more deeply. And then the last part is that they have the choice to write an action research portion where they kind of elaborate their thoughts on how this is working. So this is an actual example of one of the memos that the mentors have written. For the past school year, we had a total of 10 mentors who did the virtual mentoring at Mead Middle School. And we created a separate qualitative team composed of 10 coders who looked at each of the mentors' memos. So essentially, we had one main coder who was assigned per mentor. And in order to just have like an inter-rater reliability, we also had coders who worked in pairs to side check each other's code so that 2 mentors could code together and help each other to have like consistent coding. After the coders all coded for the memos, mentors memos, what we did was we combined all the 10 mini code books to create like a final code book. So Sasha and I went in to combine all the 10 code books, and then we kind of cleaned that up so that we could have like a finalized version. And similarly, we also tried to ensure inter-rater reliability. So we cross-checked each other's work. This is example of how we kind of did the coding process. If you can see, there's like the descriptive memo and analytic memo. We kind of went in and we highlighted portions that we were going to take out to code. Next slide. And this is how we did the coding process as well. We took out the codes and we kind of grouped them together to create bigger themes.
Great, thanks so much, Jenny. And after doing all of the combining of the code books and looking at some of the overarching themes that we found, three that we wanted to talk about today, just lightly. The first one was this idea of challenges to mentoring, internal factors, meaning difficulties that arose within the mentee that were sometimes uncontrollable by the mentor, and external factors, which were difficulties that were outside of the mentee's control, but mostly imposed either by the structure of the program or the virtual setting. And the second overarching theme was this idea of cultural differences and learning to adapt to those cultural differences. Our mentee to mentor population was 96% mentees were African American, to about a over like 90% international student population, with also Asian American mentor population. So it was a pretty big cultural divide. And we saw that through this distinct cultural differences, they learn to adapt and talk and communicate to one another by creating safe spaces, by coming up with discussion topics that would interest one another, and by taking suggestions from the mentees to improve their practice. And the third theme was this idea of establishing virtual relationships. And this was done through a collection of online tools and online resources that the mentors developed, and by the mentors themselves looking at how they could continue to work their practice a little better. So we'll talk a little bit deeper about each one of these. Andy, could you change the slide? Thanks. So here we're looking at, when we were looking at mentor challenges, we found that despite being online, some of the regular challenges persisted, whether that be students having low energy, low motivation, disengagement for whatsoever reason. But we also found some really unique challenges that were particular to the technical world, whether that be like Zoom fatigue, choosing to only chat or communicate through chat, and then just also virtual group dynamics. Depending on if there were different mentees or mentors missing, we would combine groups to allow folks to have the adequate number needed for the mentoring session, and sometimes that created different dynamics. Next slide. So what we found through that is that when mentors were trying to communicate across culture, they used 4 tools to really help them to enhance their craft. One was their choice of communication. So whether that we found that a lot of mentors, when communicating across cultures, like to use visual tools like art, storytelling, creating mood boards, videos, using chat box check-ins with emoticons. All of these were tools that they used to enhance their communication and build their rapport with mentees who sometimes were shy or didn't really feel like they could trust the mentor. Over time, this allowed them to find multiple ways to communicate that were outside of the box. The second one was learning about others. We found that mentors also push themselves to talk about conversation topics that were sometimes uncomfortable, like racial equity, cultural differences, politics, civic activities. And this was in addition to, academics, school of choice, and different things that were going on at home. The third point was they encouraged exploration. So they continued to have this idea of how can I bring in the 5-step possibility model and allow my mentee to explore other realms like psychoeducation, college, career development. And the last one is that they created these safe spaces through emotional exploration, allowing for vulnerability, giving mutual support and inspiration. Next slide. The final theme here was establishing virtual relationships, and we found that they did this in two main ways. The first, like I mentioned, was this building of a virtual toolkit, so to say, where they used various multimedia activities such as YouTube, screen sharing, Google searches, emoticon check-ins, as alternatives for students to express themselves, but also for them to have ways that they could choose from depending on what lesson they were doing. And this was an interactive process where mentors would also learn from one another and say, hey, you know, I saw you use that. I'm going to also grab that and use it myself. Which then that in turn enhanced their virtual bonding. Mentors in the memos we would read that they would constantly talk about making inferences for themselves. When I use the emoticon check-in, I found that so-and-so tends to chat more versus when I do it, you know, just talking. They made impressions. They started to monitor their own growth in their action research portion of the memo. They talked about how, you know, their own feelings of not being comfortable talking about certain topics, but learning to listen more and maybe try to speak less and try to really understand where the other person was coming from. They also engaged in personal research. If there was students who, for example, wanted to explore a career in YouTube and mentors didn't really know what types of careers that would lead to, we would find that in the mentoring memos, mentors would go and conduct extra research to make sure that they were well versed on what possibilities could develop from that kind of a career, and then would report back to the mentee. So a lot of this grew organically just from the conversations and from being able to adapt and listen to one another. And that kind of concludes some of our findings, and we're still kind of working through a lot of the data, but we hope that this is like just a little taste of, you know, what can happen across cultures in virtual mentoring.